Hello and welcome to episode 176 of Prose. This week, peer and ponder into the quasi-distant future, and relive listening to a bedtime story. I actually have some updates for all things stories here at Prose, and that is just say hi. Say hi on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I won't give you all the rest of the usual razzle-dazzle, but I'd love to interact with you all more. I'd love to hear what you'd like to hear here on the podcast as far as stories are concerned. And if you're an author, please don't forget that I take submissions all the time. I love hearing outside voices on the show. You can find the submission guidelines and where to submit at prosepodcast.com. But that's all the rambling I'm going to do for today. Let's get to episode 176 in these tales, shall we? First up, we have 2068, and secondly, Goodnight, Sleep Tight. Enjoy.
"2068", an original short story by Jared I. McGee.
So, you're right here, in this beautiful room on October 2nd, 2017. But I have a question for all you this fine morning. Where do you think that you will be on October 2nd, 2068?
The room was chiefly silent, though mostly out of disengagement more than any pensiveness. Still, the speaker, Jason Onray, the head of alumni relations for the private school, had made the crowd of students, teachers, and extended school staff at least take a brief moment to think. That is no small task at 7:30 in the morning.
2068, you guys,
he repeated again, his words echoing off the oaken walls of the cavernous dining hall. Katrina, Mr. Sam Shift's lieutenant of his advisory group, spoke up rather quickly, whispering under her breath, the senior in high school intending her words only for Mr. S, as the kids lovingly called him.
Mr. S, that's crazy. I'll be like 68. Let's do the math for you too.
He cringed.
I figured out last Tuesday that you've got to be 35, right? So, if I'm right, then... Whoa! You'll be 85! See? Crazy, huh, Mr. S? So weird to think about.
Mr. Shift... No, right. Mr. S, as he was now universally known, as no one was close enough to him to know him as Sam, flinched at the girl's excited utterance. He took a swig of his skunky off-brand school coffee, overly laden with cream and sugar, and he winced at the heat. 85 years old. Yeesh. That was, as per current averages as far as he knew, beyond what most men lived. Maybe there would be medical advances by then, further extending life, yes, but even more importantly to him, further magnifying and extending quality of life as well. Miracles were happening every day in the information and technology age, after all. But shit, 35 was damn old too. And that's where he was. There was so much that Sam, not Mr. S or Mr. Shift, had wanted to accomplish by now. Publications, performances, some semblance of fame or notoriety, financial independence, financial abilities beyond simple independence, and what was necessary, freeing him up to help his family and what few dear friends there were left. Marriage. A honeymoon out of a fairy tale. Children. At least one or two. A PhD. A job that truly made him feel accomplished and like he was making a lasting difference in the world. That was all on 6-year-old Sam's mind and the tip of 6-year-old Sam's tongue. To the extent that it could be for a 6-year-old. When he'd walk home after a hard day of first grade with his best friend Jonathan, back in Thiessen, Arkansas. They were young philosophers back then. Dreamers. This early morning life math was sickening. It was certainly souring his stomach to his already challenging sludge of faux coffee. Masters at 22. Not bad. Full professorship at 23? Excellent. Impressive even. At least to many around him, particularly those still laboring in his small town where the only work was at the paper mill. And that work made the acrid smell of the paper-making process seep into the skin and clothes and hair. It was like piss. Acidic, stale, ever-present piss. Always. He'd escaped that, at least. But then, atrophy. And nothingness for, what is it now, 12 years? Even now, if Sam had a child this year, something utterly unlikely to happen, seeing as the girl he'd planned on marrying decided to choose alcohol and grasping at 19-year-olds' dreams and goals over him, if he'd not been waiting until Christmas to pop the question, but that was... anyway, he'd be 55 by the time that child was 20. In reality, he would never get to truly know this would-be progeny as an adult. To have the fulfilling relationship a father has when their child is older and wiser and capable of reflection and a different type of bonding. And the likelihood of him having the opportunity to know his hypothetical grandchildren from that would-be son or daughter in any meaningful capacity was even greater. That line of reasoning brought on even darker thoughts that contrasted nicely with the sparkling autumn sunlight surging in from the enormous windows that ringed the octagonal dining hall. His parents were even now edging towards 70. In fact, they were all but there already. It was now all but guaranteed that they would not know his children, were he ever to be blessed with them. All those imaginary kids that he'd be having sometime in the next 12 months would only get 10 years or so, if genetics in his own grandparents' lives were any marker. This realization shook his world. Sam's vision spun. His own grandparents were such a foundational part of his childhood, who he was as a person. Their lessons and unfiltered, unrelenting love and support had made him feel invincible, intelligent. He quite literally could not imagine growing up without their guidance and kindness and rearing. To think that the lessons and traditions of his family had a strong chance of dying out with him, because of him, made his stomach roil some more. He felt bile rise in his throat. Sam thought he might vomit right there in front of everyone. He began to wish his randomly assigned table was somewhere nearer the back of the dining space, away from the podium, the microphones, and the eyes of the entire community.
Mr. S, you okay?
Katrina's voice came soft and still in the reduced whisper version of what was normally an excited alto bordering on soprano.
You look like you don't feel too well. Do I need to get the nurse or...
Sam shook his head and began to stamp down the thoughts that were a torrent. He consciously locked Sam away in a corner of himself, and he brought back the more reliable, far less emotional Mr. S.
Oh, it's okay, Katrina. I'll be fine. I think the school's coffee is just getting to me again.
He jested, taking the easy road of criticizing the easily criticizable coffee and effectively pivoting her concerned gaze back to its usual partial attention on the podium, partial attention to whatever the scanning field of vision could bring to her. Mr. S took another deep, calming breath or two, but he was jolted fully back into the moment when he heard,
And now, Mr. S is going to come on up here and explain what's going on this weekend with the big field trips that I know everyone has been looking forward to. Mr. S, take it away.
He cringed inwardly, but kept the heavy-lidded twinkle and accompanying half-smirk that everyone was so accustomed to prominent on his face as he stood. He would go lead the charge for the remainder of the early meeting, hyping up the students, the faculty, the staff, as he always did. But Sam would be crying out from somewhere else inside of him, begging for publications, performances, some semblance of fame or notoriety, financial independence, a family not destitute and desperate, marriage, a honeymoon out of a fairy tale, children, at least one or two, a PhD, a job that truly made him feel accomplished and like he was making a lasting difference in the world. Of Jonathan, of Thiessen, Arkansas, and all that childhood wisdom he'd forgotten to keep prominent in his life. The heavy-lidded twinkle and accompanying half-smirk did not falter, but a single tear rolled down his right cheek as he made his way to the podium.
Thank you for listening to 2068. All sounds present come from freesound.org. They are all being used under CC 1.0 public domain dedication licenses. That falls under the Creative Commons umbrella. Next up, stick around for Goodnight, Sleep Tight, a reconsideration of insomnia and the bedtime story.
Goodnight, Sleep Tight, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Bedtime stories? You know, I honestly think that we do ourselves a real disservice ending those at such a young age. How many times a week does some woman or man decry their body speaking out against its rebellion against their perceived needs in the form of insomnia? God knows that I can't get a good night's sleep to save my life. Well, if we're being honest, it's the falling asleep part that is so very problematic. That's the problem with you too, right? If I remember correctly, you said that you have trouble getting to sleep amid the whirring and buzzing of the 10,000 thoughts going on in your head day in and day out, only culminating in an even greater cacophony as you try to put them and you to rest. What is the most distracting for you? Is it the host of questions about the decisions you made throughout the day? Is it the even greater host of questions you have about why you are here, what your life means, and if there are greater forces at play than just, well, us stumbling and grunting around for a few years before we return to the ground? Do you still imagine yourself somewhere more exotic, with someone just a little more your speed than Steven? Or have you resigned yourself that the current life you lead will be the only one you ever do? There is nothing wrong with that, of course. But you always seemed so damned adamant that such a fate was not one that awaited you, O princess of the unhad adventure. Is it just backtracking that keeps your eyes wide as you're trying to allow yourself some peace? Going back and forth throughout any given anything throughout your day, just reliving what you did so that in some way you are living double the time you might have, exponentially increasing your time on this rock? Do you want to know what I do when the blackness and the silence are too much for me to bear? I numb myself. Not with booze or drugs or any of that, of course, but I do toss on podcasts and swear to myself that I'm learning something. Or I flip open my Netflix app on my phone and put something on, anything, that makes my inner voices not silent, but overridden by the inane blathering of some bullshit show that has no greater meaning or purpose than that of a distraction from the absurdity that is this mortal coil. I avoid entertainment on all things spiritual or geopolitical. It's best to avoid such topics when trying to deaden your thoughts and get some sleep. I personally prefer cartoons. Newer ones with not much action. Duller so the lights, colors, and verve from the voice actors do not keep me awake. Newer so the danger of wandering into the realm of nostalgia for yesteryear does not find me, as it does so often when listening to that one song from that one year or watching that one episode from that one time when we lived there. I can't be traipsing through the past, recent or distant, if I hope to sleep. Stand-up comedy is sometimes good, but I do often find myself allowing even that to spur me into thought. On a very rare occasion, I do allow myself to get lost in the blackness. I push away the barriers and welcome the blackness and silence with open arms, even as they cackle in their velveteen way, and the flood of unbidden memories and fantasies and hopes and fears and dreams and nightmares and mistakes and triumphs crash down upon me. Those nights are often my most productive creatively, but shit, if I don't get any real sleep. That takes me back to the matter at hand. All those podcasts and online programs are dandy for entertainment, but they don't have the same soothing effect as a good old bedtime story. What I wouldn't give to be a little one again, nestled in my pallet on the floor of a 200-year-old house in southern Mississippi, listening to my daddy drawl out a fanciful tale of his own making. Or settled in on the couch for a good nap in that same house, sopping up every drip of family lore my granddaddy chose to share. Or sitting in the car on a long drive, my mother reading my younger brother and me a story as we stared out the window, imagining greater things, only to be met by sleep unannounced, unsought. So, what do we grown-ups do about this major disconnect, huh? I know you said that texting until 3 a.m. isn't a problem for you because of this major need for some assistance in sleeping. I really do hate that your indecisions and, even worse, your decisions are keeping you awake and tormented, but maybe we can reach back to our childhood, as we joked, and see if we can't find a solution. I think you're right for the record. The answer is bedtime stories. They are the panacea to the adult insomniac's brain, I reckon. At least, that's what the still living dreamer in me would like to believe. Why don't we give it a go? You're a science-minded woman after all. The only way we'll know is if we test it.
The Goblin and the Grocer. There was once a hard-working student who lived in an attic, and he had nothing in the world of his own. There was also a hard-working grocer who lived on the first floor and had the whole house for his own. The goblin belonged to him, for every Christmas Eve there was, waiting for him at the grocer's, a dish of jam with a large lump of butter in the middle. The grocer could afford this, so the goblin stayed in the grocer's shop, and this teaches us a good deal. One evening, the student came in by the back door to buy a candle and some cheese. He had no one to send, so he came himself. He got what he wanted, paid for it, and nodded a good evening to the grocer and his wife. She was a woman who could do more than nod, she could talk. When the student had said goodnight, he suddenly stood still, reading the sheet of paper in which the cheese had been wrapped. It was a leaf torn out of an old book, a book of poetry.
There's more of that over there,
said the grocer.
I gave an old woman some coffee for the book. If you like to give me 2p, you can have the rest.
Why, yes, said the student. Give me the book instead of the cheese. I can eat my bread without cheese. It would be a shame to leave the book to be torn up. You're a clever and practical man, but about poetry you understand as much as the old tub over there.
And that sounded rude as far as the tub was concerned,
but the grocer laughed, and so did the student.
it was only said in fun. But the goblin was angry
that anyone should dare to say such a thing to a grocer who owned the house and sold the best butter. When it was night and the shop was shut, and everyone was in bed except the student, the goblin went upstairs and took the grocer's wife's tongue. She did not use it when she was asleep, and on whatever object in the room he put it, that thing began to speak, and it spoke out its thoughts and feelings just as well as the lady to whom it belonged. But only one thing at a time could use it, and that was a good thing, or they would have all spoken together. The goblin laid the tongue on the tub, in which were the old newspapers.
Is it true,
he asked,
that you know nothing about poetry?
Certainly not,
answered the tub.
Poetry is something that is in the papers, and that is frequently cut out. I have a great deal more in me than the student has, and yet I am only a small tub in the grocer's shop.
And the goblin put the tongue on the coffee mill, and now it began to grind. He put it on the butter cask, and on the till, and all were of the same opinion as the waste paper tub. And one must believe the majority.
Now I will tell the student.
And with these words, the goblin crept softly up the stairs to the attic where the student lived. There was a light burning, and the goblin peeped through the keyhole and saw that he was reading the torn book that he had bought in the shop. But oh, how bright it was! Out of the book shot a streak of light, which grew into a large tree and spread its branches far above the student. Every leaf was alive, and every flower was a beautiful girl's head, some with dark and shining eyes, others with wonderful blue ones. Every fruit was a glittering star, and there was a marvelous music in the student's room. The little goblin had never even dreamt of such a splendid sight, much less seen it. He stood on tiptoe, gazing and gazing till the candle in the attic was put out. The student had blown it out and had gone to bed, but the goblin remained standing outside listening to the music, which very softly and sweetly was now singing the student a lullaby.
This, said the goblin. I never expected this. I must stay with the student.
The little fellow thought it over. for he was a sensible goblin. Then he sighed. The student has no jam. And on that he went down to the grocer again, and it was a good thing that he did not go back, for the tub had nearly worn out the tongue. It had read everything that was inside it, on the one side, and was just going to turn itself around and read from the other side when the goblin came in and returned the tongue to its owner. But the whole shop, from the till down to the shavings, from that night changed their opinion of the tub, and they looked up to it, and had such faith in it, that they were under the impression that when the grocer read the art and drama critiques of the paper in the evenings, it all came from the tub. But the goblin could no longer sit quietly, sitting to the wisdom and intellect downstairs. No, as soon as the light shone in the evening from the attic, it seemed to him as though its beams were strong ropes dragging him up, and he had to go and peep through the keyhole. There, he felt the sort of feeling we have looking on the great rolling sea in a storm, and he burst into tears. He could not himself say why he wept, but in spite of his tears, he felt quite happy. How beautiful it must be to sit under that tree with the student. But that he could not do. He had to content himself with the keyhole and be happy there. There he stood out on the cold landing, the autumn wind blowing through the cracks of the floor. It was cold. Very cold, but he first found out when the light in the attic was put out and the music in the wood died away. Then it froze him, and he crept down again into his warm corner. There it was comfortable and cozy. When Christmas came, and with it the jam and the large lump of butter, then the grocer was first with him. But in the middle of the night the goblin awoke, hearing a great noise and knocking against the shutters, people hammering from outside. The watchman was blowing his horn. A great fire had broken out. The whole town was in flames. Was it in the house? Or was it in a neighbor's? Where was it? The alarm increased. The grocer's wife was so terrified that she took the gold earrings out of her ears and put them in her pocket in order to save something. The grocer seized his account books and the maid her black silk dress. Everyone wanted to save his most valuable possession. So did the goblin, and in a few leaps he was up the stairs and in the student's room. He was standing quietly by the open window looking at the fire that was burning in the neighbor's house just opposite. The goblin seized the book lying on the table, put it in his red cap, and clasped it with both hands. The best treasure in the house was saved, and he climbed out on the roof. With it there, under his cap, and on to the chimney. There he sat, lighted up by the flames from the burning house opposite, both hands holding tightly on his head and on his red cap, which lay the treasure. And now he knew what his heart really valued most, to whom he really belonged. But when the fire was put out, and the goblin thought it was over, then, "I will divide myself between the two," he said. "I cannot quite give up the grocer because of the jam." And it is just the same with us. We also cannot quite give up the grocer just because of the jam. Oh, don't be too impressed. That's an oldie but goodie from Hans Christian Andersen, that fantastic Danish man. You know, jeg elsker Danmark og Andersen. Vidste du, at jeg taler lidt dansk? I guess that's not something you'd care about right now, so very late at night and sneaking toward your tomorrow. I guess that last story didn't work fully, huh? Or you'd not be talking to me. How about a second shorter story to send you to dreamland? I seem to remember my grandmother reading to and always to since, as a little one, I clung to the waking world. Let's see. The Curious Princess. Once upon a time, there was a princess who had everything. Everything. Her king father loved her. Her queen mother loved her. The people of her fair land loved her. And she even had a young princely suitor she'd known since she was a wee tot that had loved her for all the years of her life with a true and deep love. She had everything a princess should want. That same princess, though, felt strange almost every day. When her king father told her how much he loved her, her heart was warmed, but she still felt a little lost. When her queen mother told her how much she loved her, the princess's heart was warmed, but she felt still quite out of place there in the castle. When the crowds that lined the cobblestone streets or stood in the square during a royal outing or pronouncement shouted out, exclaiming how much they loved her, her heart was warmed, but she couldn't help but look beyond those streets and that city square off past the dense forest that she had never been beyond. When her princely suitor told her how much he loved her, her heart was warmed, but she felt empty. One day, the princess received a scroll sealed with a purple wax seal and in a script that she was, at first, unfamiliar with. She excitedly broke the seal and looked upon the scroll. The princess read, quickly realizing that this was a note scrawled from an old friend, long since having been removed from the castle and the fair land because of a desire for adventure and making a new path for themselves. The princess's old playing companion invited her to come to the frozen lands on the sea, so she too could experience new sights, new sounds, new tastes, and more. The princess immediately knew that her king father, queen mother, beloved lands people, and her princely suitor would shoot this invitation down, disallowing her to go to the north to see the seas and all the other sights. These lands were known as the Blasted Lands, down in the warm southern reaches, as they were said to be frozen solid for all the months of the year save one. And the people were thought to be brash and angry and unwelcoming, their hearts as frozen as the seas and the rivers and the lakes. So the princess was stuck in a conundrum. Most princesses would kill for a king father, queen mother, beloved lands people, and princely suitor to love them unreservedly. But she was not most princesses. Her eyes always drifted beyond the horizons of the realm, beyond the impassable forests to the northeast, beyond the flattened mountains to the northwest, beyond the endless drowned delta to the southeast, beyond the deadly deserts to the southwest. Impassable, flattened, endless, or deadly. The princess wanted to experience these places for herself. She wanted to go beyond maps and fairy stories that her nurse would read her. She wanted to see these epic landscapes for herself, experience the world. Though she was of age, and even a little bit beyond the land's usual marrying age for princesses, which was, in her royal opinion, far too young, her king father, her queen mother, her beloved lands people, and her princely suitor would not hear of her taking even more time to go on adventures, potentially putting herself at risk. Even worse, they wouldn't understand the drive to do so. Why go beyond the southern reach, the summer lands, the land of eternal bounty? And honestly, she couldn't tell them why. That was part of the problem. She just knew that she needed to experience more? Something different. Her 10,000 times 10,000 thoughts and doubts flitted through her head. She rolled the scroll back up and slipped it into her bodice beneath the extensive folds of her dress. No one would go fishing in there. Not with a princess. Unthinking, the princess packed the rough leather travel pack that she had purchased as a bit of a gaffe at a festival, her princely suitor laughing at the notion of a princess going adventuring all the while. The memory of that laughter made her cheeks burn with anger. For a prince that loved her so much, he sure didn't think much of her capabilities and strengths and talents. Within half an hour, she was packed to leave. She even put some pilfered snacks that she always kept squirreled away hidden in her room into the pack. As a princess, she was thought to not need as much food as a boy or even a regular girl. She needed to stay trim. Yet, she was always hungry, so she kept piles of unprincess-like snacks around her room. These made up her victual supply in her pack. She turned and looked back out the window at the southern reach, the summer lands, the land of eternal bounty. And she thought of her king father, queen mother, beloved lands people, and her princely suitor, and just how much they loved her. Could she really leave them? But could she smile and bow to her king father and not lose part of her heart? Could she sew and play harp with her queen mother and not have her smile falter? Could she wave and curtsy to the people of the land and not feel her unhappiness on display? Could she marry the princely suitor without ever having been something other than a princess defined by her king father, queen mother, land's people, and princely suitor himself? As the sun began to make the impassable forest trees' shadowy counterparts grow long, the princess made her decision. She... Oh my, I think that second one did it. Am I right? I don't hear you replying, so I'm guessing that worked the trick. Your Etherean angel breath rhythmically ebbing and intensifying, each in a moment, each in kind. That breath bears none of the weight we were just decrying. I'll leave it to you then. Let this stand as a testament to the effectiveness of the bedtime story, of hearing a voice with no selfish intentions simply reading out the fates of princes and princesses, witches and wizards, goblins and grocers to a listener who knows they will find sleep in fantasy and far from the barbs of reality. Good night. Sleep tight.
Thank you for listening to Goodnight, Sleep Tight. All noises and musical tracks in the background of this story come from freesound.org. The sounds and tracks are all being used under CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication licenses. I don't do this very often, but I'd also like to say that this story was very openly inspired by a dear friend of mine. If you're out there listening, I sure hope it brought some comfort. That does it this week for Prose. I cannot thank you all enough for listening. As always, I am so grateful. We will be back in 2 weeks' time with another episode, and until then, love those around you, tell them that you do, show them some kindness, and embrace this life as it is, always, stranger than fiction. Again, thank you for listening.